Phew, it's been a while, hasn't it? All I've got to say at this point is Hornby, Barbergate, anything to do with that other castle. We've got important things to talk about here. Oh boy, so 2022 will more than likely go down in history as the year that the rail industry in the UK, for want of a better term, itself. Now, I'm aware of recent events that have been going on in the US rail industry to do with Congress signing anti-strike legislation, the incident in Ohio, the other incidents before and after Ohio, and the hullabaloo last year about the whole US rail industry coming under government scrutiny. But there's a whole lot to unpack there, and there's already a ton and a bit to unpack here, so we might come back to the States, perhaps. To those who aren't aware of what's going on in the UK, public sector industries are feeling the strains of dilapidating working conditions, resulting in strike action to prevent lower job security and inadequate pay in the face of spiralling inflation and longer work hours. But if you'd listened just to the tabloid press and not bothered to do your own research, you'd think the rail disputes were all about pay. The subsequent myths about rail staff have been unbelievable. One of them being that during negotiation, the Rail Maritime and Transport Union rejected a generous 8% pay rise. In reality, said offer was 4% for the first year, 4% for a second year, and then there was no guarantee of staff retention after that. Keep in mind that inflation rose higher than 4% in 2022. The reason that any subsequent deal has been rejected hasn't been entirely on account of pay, but on account of unacceptable clauses being written into it, including implementing driver-only operation as a standard precedent across many train operating companies. I've already done an editorial on the consequences of DOO when Southern tried to implement it, but to save you the homework, driver-only operation basically does away with guards on passenger trains, leaving the driver as the only qualified member of staff to evacuate passengers in an emergency. The driver also has to rely on CCTV cameras to see if passengers have all gotten on or off the train, which tend to fog up in cold weather, and despite the occasional presence of onboard supervisors in some cases, they're the most critically trained human on board, with all of the route knowledge and qualifications to dismount the train and walk along the track if needs must. Two problems with that though. They're also the most busy and vulnerable person on board. If an incident breaks out on the train, say if a passenger gets harassed or even attacked and killed, then the driver can't exactly leave their post to come and deal with it. And if there's an accident, the driver is still the most likely person to get killed. Now, to be fair to DOO, it's in full swing on the London Underground, but average speeds are lower, times between stops are shorter, most of the network is submerged below ground, and fare dodging is fully protected by barriers. So an enclosed system like that doesn't necessarily warrant having a guard on board. But somewhere like the former Cambrian network in rural Wales, which runs through miles of open countryside with non-existent mobile signal, or the East Coast Main Line where trains could run non-stop at higher speeds between major towns hundreds of miles apart from each other, carry more risk should the unthinkable happen. And when it comes to multiple unit working, if a pair of forecast sets are coupled together with no corridor connection, like the old Class 465s, then people in the front set might get evacuated by the driver in an emergency, but people in the back set won't. The other major issue written into the rejected deal was concerning station staff. With increasing use of apps to book tickets in advance, higher authorities have eyed up closing ticket offices and rebranding platform staff, possibly laying more responsibilities on them in a bid to stretch existing labour. Thing is though, closing ticket offices and stretching station staff could mean an increase in fare dodgers, antisocial behaviour from other passengers, possibly suicides, and to any passengers with heavy luggage or a physical disability, no help in getting them on and off the train, which technically goes against Section 20 Clause 3 of the Equality Act of 2010. And if you put barriers at every station in the country, you're normally going to need gateline assistants to man them anyway. And on that point, the role of gateline assistant sometimes tends to be set aside for someone who's physically unable to do their previous job in the rail industry. But if the new legislation were to go ahead, the gateline assistant is likely to be reclassified as a safety-critical role, regardless of whether that assistant is physically up for the job or not. This is the side of modernisation that the public tends not to get informed about. What's seen as progress for profiteers can be a headache to those on the ground. Now, there was an argument brought up early on that wages drive inflation, but that's also been quickly debunked, as most rail staff haven't had a pay rise for nearly 3 years, yet the train operating companies have been running at a profit through the pandemic and inflation has just been going up anyway, With calls being made for staff to work longer hours on top of that, a pay freeze is more or less the equivalent of a pay cut. It's not helped when privatisation in this country has been set up in such a way that the TOCs don't seem to get the financial hit you'd think they would receive when services grind to a halt.
When these strikes take place, the passengers who don't get on the trains are compensated by the taxpayer, and the taxpayer is compensating and paying for the operating company. The only people making money are the operating company, and they're saying, we don't care if their passengers on board, it's cheaper, we make more money. That's a deal that this government struck. It's not funny, it's just really annoying.
And that was in 2016 concerning all companies grouped under Gavia Thameslink. But since more of the system came under government control during the pandemic, more and more companies are being subsidised on strike days. So from a frontline railway worker's perspective, just how essential are guards and platform staff? Why should we take more notice of the unions instead of the press? And how important is it for them to strike for better working conditions? Well, since the start of this year, I've spoken to a number of railway workers in numerous frontline roles in a bid to let them have their say on the matter. For protection, the following testimonies shall remain anonymous while their views are expressed. One platform attendant working in the south of England says, "On one occasion, I was told I had a couple of passengers with luggage arriving to change for a London service who needed help with their bags. Standard assist. As I met them, it turned out to be a couple I'd helped previously when heading off to meet their family for Christmas, who beamed at the sight of me. They remembered my name, followed with the remark of, 'Oh yay, it's you. Hello.' They asked me if I had a nice Christmas and complimented what a nice service I offered. And as I sent them off to London, they wished me a happy new year and to keep up the good work. Little fleeting moments like that make me feel very proud of the work I do." Unfortunately, that was one of the nicer testimonies I found. One conductor working in the Birmingham area says, "I had one incident with a guy stood Muslim praying at Small Heath station on an island platform. My train one side, he the other. If I hadn't dashed and grabbed him, he'd have been sucked under a fast Chiltern train maybe 10 seconds later." One conductor working in southeast England says, "I was doing a ticket check one morning and I came across this guy who was completely passed out, but I couldn't wake him. I shouted at him, used my whistle with him, and eventually I put out an emergency call. The police turned up at the next station who declared he's not faking it and called for an ambulance who then treated him. If I hadn't been there, people would have assumed that he was asleep and just left him to die." He carries on to state, "When a train is working DOO, if the driver looks at the monitors, the moment he puts the handle into power, he can't see the monitors. Part of me being there is to look out the window as we're pulling away. So if someone runs up to the train as it's pulling away, bangs their hand on the side of the train, I can go ding with a button and perform an emergency stop before anything goes wrong. By having someone walking through the train, you can find things like a little old lady who says, 'How do I get from A to B?' I had a lady get off the train the other day who said she'd fallen asleep and got off at the wrong station. I asked her where she was trying to get to, told her which train to get on next. The train came and went. Then 10 minutes later she turned up again saying she got confused and needed more help." One of the rail industry's core values is everyone home safe every day. So I make sure that's my top priority, whether I'm on the train or just there to give out the right information. One guard working in southwest England says, "We have an unofficial WhatsApp group which is used for revenue protection purposes, and every single day we get at least one message asking for BTP, that's British Transport Police to those who don't know, because of an aggressive customer, whether they be male, female, ticket dispute, drunk, drugged, what have you. A lot of people don't realise that missing persons or suicidal persons often get picked up by guards first. So if they're not planning on doing anything at the station they're getting in at, they'll get away from their local station so they're harder to find. There's been a few times where children have run away. Children are being abused with physical injuries, mental health missing persons, dementia missing persons, etc. If there's a missing persons report, the guard picks them up first." He goes on to explain about driver-only operation himself, saying, "On our company, drivers refused an extra 5 to 6 grand a year for driver-only operated trains, namely ones that were fitted with cameras that were later removed, because they didn't want the extra responsibility on top of driving the train." And on that point, people might assume that driving a train is easy because they don't need a steering wheel. But the driver still needs to memorize hundreds of miles of routes, every set of points, signal positions, signal type, speed limit, be they temporary or fixed, level crossing, even where nearby traffic lights are so they don't get confused for being signals in the dark. All the while, their actions are being recorded by a black box in the cab, and by rule, their mobile phone has to be switched off. so the guard can see service updates, but the driver can't. And all of this is before anyone tries to jump in front of their train. One member of staff at a busy Outer London commuter station says, "Where I'm based at, we get an awful lot of antisocial behaviour, and even with some of the other incidents that are tied up away from it, like missing people's reports, fatalities and so on, people have always been on hand to at least deal with those situations firsthand. It does act as a deterrent if members of staff are on the platform to help deal with these matters. We have to put a call out for police assistance once every 2 to 3 days, either because of fare evasion, trespassing, dealing with intoxicated or aggressive customers and so on. We're just fortunate the Met Police are only just down the road. We have to keep a log sheet every single day, and in the case of extreme circumstances, that gets reported to control immediately. What happens beyond that is beyond our control, but the level of work that we're responsible for and have to deal with bears no boundaries whatsoever. Someone could look at my job and go, "Oh, that's easy," but there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. And it's not just the staff who've got horror stories to tell. One railway historian recently said, "Ever since Reddish North Station opened in 1875, trains towards Manchester have always used Platform 1. The station staff know this, regular rail users know this. The demented computer which runs the automatic platform announcements, however, does not." So picture the scene. The regular group of regulars huddled under the platform canopy, and a large group, 20 or so of mums, dads, granddads and their chidlings off to Manchester for a day out. Demented computer parrot announces,
"The next train to depart from Platform 2 will be the 11:54 Northern service to Manchester Piccadilly."
The 20 or so parents and chidlings rush over the footbridge, watched by the regulars. The booking office clerk comes out, shouts over to Platform 2, "If you want Manchester, Platform 1, the machine's broken." The group of parents and toddlers recross the footbridge to Platform 1. All is going well. And then, just as the 11:54 is about to pull in, the Dalek announcing machine blurts out,
"The next train to depart from Platform 2 will be the 11:54 Northern service to Manchester Piccadilly."
Can you guess what happened next? Did the ticket clerk come out of their office and over the engine noise shout that it was Platform 1 to Manchester? He did. And did the 20 or so carers and careys stampede over the footbridge, despite the train flagging up that it was from Manchester on its display boards, to Platform 2? They did. And just as the slightly delayed 11:54 was departing, the 11:56 to Sheffield drew nigh, arriving at Platform 2, wherein the voice of the Mysterons announced,
"The next train to depart from Platform 2 will be the 11:56 Northern service to Sheffield."
So imagine the scene as I was whisked away in my seat towards Manchester. And then there are the things that passengers have put on social media in recent months. There were 3 mechanical failures of new Class 175 trains on Transport for Wales services, one of which went viral on the 8th of February because it was the guard who got everybody off the train with no fatalities. There was the train in Kent that caught fire, and again, only avoided fatality when the guard was there to evacuate all the passengers. And what about all the physical and sexual assault that doesn't get talked about because a member of staff is around to prevent it? How do you make public transport more attractive by removing onboard deterrents in antisocial behaviour? In fact, another testimony in the southwest says that a large number of locals actively avoid going to London because of the horror stories they hear about the lack of safety critically trained staff in DOO areas. Honestly, the only amusing thing to come out of all of this is seeing Mick Lynch publicly humiliate any of the mainstream news outlets that tried to liken him to the Hood or the Grinch or any other kind of irrelevant cretin. I mean, come on. People can't get to work, can't get to interviews, see loved ones, go socialising, go on holiday. Rail staff put their nose to the grindstone through the deadliest period since World War II. Safety concerns become paramount. Local economies look set to lose trade as a result of loss of movement. And all the Murdoch Empire can care about is, so, which supervillain does the RMT secretary look like? If it weren't for outlets like Politics Joe, Double Down News, and hey, even good old-fashioned Private Eye, which is still being produced in print form en masse, people wouldn't be able to learn just how farcical things have become. Now, it's true that some people in the rail industry are not striking, but it's worth pointing out that shooting them all down isn't really going to help. Some are unable to strike simply because they can't afford to forfeit their wages, or that home circumstances have become too strenuous for them. There are timetable planners and managers who have to work out emergency services weeks ahead of when the strikes do take place, so they can be kept working at all sorts of silly hours. And what about the staff that are employed by independent agencies instead of operating companies? Quite often, they're left to take the brunt of distraught passengers when they're not even responsible for what's going on. That doesn't mean they don't necessarily agree with those who are striking, it's just that there's not always a blanket rule. It's also interesting to note the cost of keeping things going during strike days. To employ contingency guards and drivers at a safety-critical level, crash course training is being provided to non-operational staff, who, in some cases, are then being paid up to £500 per employee per strike day. Sounds fantastic to whoever's on salary that doesn't get overtime, but the trouble is that it normally takes weeks of more intense training in these roles for a reason, namely route knowledge. So there's contingency staff being fast-tracked into crewing trains with more basic route knowledge and experience at a much higher pay rate than a normal guard with more experience. Looking at the results in various RMT ballots, it's interesting to note that, on East Midland Railways at least, more votes were cast in favour of action short of a strike instead of more strike action. Now, action short of a strike normally means frontline staff strictly working their specified hours without doing any cover days or overtime whatsoever. So if a driver and a guard both called in sick, then another driver and guard would have to be called in to cover them so that train could run. But if more people worked to their specified time, more trains would get cancelled because contingency staff would be less prepared to take over during their normal office jobs. Operating companies get subsidised during strike days but fined for cancellations, so it offers more financial incentive to settle disputes. Unfortunately, more cancellations mean less sympathy from the public when the workers needed the public on their side, especially at Christmas. What's more, strict action short of a strike might mean that if a train is an hour late from its destination and the driver and guard finished their shift before they ended their journey, they would either have to work the rest of their shift unpaid so they could get the train home safely, or they would have to clock off before they could finish their journey. In the latter's case, any decent railwayman would tell you that it's not safe to terminate a train just where the driver says so.
You can't do it.
Now, of course, there are age-old rules in place to prevent that sort of thing from happening, but imagine a scenario where that rule had to be broken. So it's hardly surprising the Transport Minister, Hugh Merriman, went on record saying it would have been cheaper, and no doubt a lot easier, to settle the strikes instead of letting them run on and on and on. There's obviously a lot to unpack here, more than anything that anyone in my position could put into one editorial. As of publishing this piece, Network Rail have come to a settlement, and some TOCs are progressing towards a total settlement, but there's no way of telling for sure when or even how the rest of the dispute is all going to end, or if it'll never come up again in the future. Both sides have dug in as they did in 2016 and 17, and it's the last thing the nation needs when costs and food shortages are going up. Well, aside from another bat plague, obviously. It's also worth noting that, yes, health, education, postage and other transport services have been striking around the same time frame as the railways for similar reasons. They're in different boats, caught in the same storm. So, TLDW, it's worth hashtagging keep the guard on the train wherever possible, but I think there's more that's already being said more bluntly at a less public level. We need guards on trains because people suck. We need those guards to be safety critically trained because Murphy's Law sucks. We need enough staff at stations because automation sucks. And all frontline rail staff need appreciation because, apart from the occasional bad apple, they're probably the one thing that makes the rail service not suck quite as much. I'm Chris, and I'm here to gauge the issue.
I lost my mind in lockdown, time and time again. I lost my mind in lockdown.